Suge Knight sat in that hospital room with Tupac after the shooting, and years later he said something that still haunts people. He said when he left, they were laughing and joking together. Tupac was cracking jokes with bullet wounds in his body. And then Suge added 5 words that launched 1,000 theories. If he really did die, what would make someone who was literally there question whether Tupac actually died? Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was denial. Or maybe it was because Suge knew something most people didn't. He knew about the letter. A letter Tupac wrote that went straight at the federal government, calling out the President of the United States by name, demanding answers about why black communities were being left to rot while politicians collected votes and disappeared. And some people believe that letter is exactly why Tupac had to go. Let me tell you what was actually in it. The song was called Letter to the President, and it dropped in 1999 on the posthumous album Still I Rise, alongside the Outlaws. 3 years after they put Tupac in the ground, his voice came back from the dead with a message for Bill Clinton and everyone in Washington who thought they could ignore what was happening in the streets. The album itself was a statement. Death Row Records was falling apart, but Tupac's catalog kept generating material that his team could release. Producer Johnny J and engineer Claudio Quaney had been working through sessions, transferring old recordings, finding verses that Tupac had laid down before everything went sideways. Tupac didn't write this track like a rapper trying to sound political. He wrote it like he was sitting across from Clinton at a table, looking him dead in the eyes. He opened the song by basically saying, "Hey, I know you remember what you promised us. I know you came to our neighborhoods during campaign season talking about change. So where is it? Because from where I'm standing, nothing looks different." He described cops rolling through black neighborhoods like they were zookeepers checking on animals. His words, not mine. He talked about poverty that hadn't moved an inch since Clinton took office. He talked about the crack epidemic still tearing families apart, while the government found money for everything except the people who needed it most. He called out the Secretary of Treasury directly, saying his community needed to get paid, not through welfare checks or government handouts, but through real economic opportunity and systemic change that would actually let people build something. And then he said something that probably made some very powerful people very uncomfortable. He started naming names. Team could release. Producer Johnny J and engineer Claudio Quaney had been working through sessions, transferring old recordings, finding verses that Tupac had laid down before everything went sideways. Not just Clinton. He shouted out Mutulu Shakur, his stepfather, who was sitting on the FBI's most wanted list as a Black Liberation Army associate. He mentioned Geronimo Pratt, his godfather, who had already spent 27 years locked up on a murder charge that turned out to be complete garbage. The evidence that would have freed him had been hidden, deliberately, by the same government Tupac was now putting on blast. These weren't random references thrown in for street credibility. Tupac was drawing a direct line between what happened to the people who raised him and what was still happening to black communities across America. He was saying the system didn't break. It was working exactly how it was designed to work. The letter ended with a warning. Tupac told Clinton that if things didn't change, if the cries from the marginalized kept getting ignored, mayhem was coming. He talked about weaponry that could freeze the biggest adversaries with ease. He made it clear that the pressure building in the streets would eventually explode if nobody did anything about it. 3 years before that song dropped, Tupac was dead, shot 4 times in Las Vegas on September 7th, 1996, outside the MGM Grand, after watching Mike Tyson knock out Bruce Seldon in the first round. He died 6 days later at University Medical Center. He was 25 years old. The whole thing happened fast. A white Cadillac pulled up at a red light on Flamingo Road near Koval Lane. Someone in the back seat opened fire. Suge got grazed by a bullet fragment. Tupac took rounds to his chest, arm, and thigh. One bullet hit his right lung. The official story focused on the East Coast versus West Coast beef. Investigators looked at Suge Knight's enemies, gang connections, the fight that broke out earlier that night between Death Row associates and a Crip named Orlando Anderson in the MGM Grand lobby. Surveillance footage showed Tupac and a group of Death Row affiliates stomping Anderson after someone spotted him wearing a Death Row chain that had allegedly been stolen from one of their people weeks earlier. For years, that's where the trail seemed to lead. But as time passed and the case remained unsolved, Another theory started picking up momentum, one that went way higher than gang politics. People started asking, what if the federal government wanted Tupac dead? And here's the thing, that theory isn't based on paranoia. It's based on documented history. From 1956 to 1971, the FBI ran something called COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program. The official purpose was to monitor and disrupt organizations the government considered threats to national security. In practice, that meant systematically destroying the Black Panther Party, surveilling civil rights leaders, and actively working to prevent the rise of what J. Edgar Hoover called a black messiah who could unify and electrify the masses. Hoover wrote internal memos about this. He was terrified that someone would emerge who could bring together different factions of black activism into a unified political force. The methods were brutal: infiltration, disinformation campaigns designed to turn organizations against themselves, harassment, and sometimes violence. Fred Hampton, the chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party, was shot and killed during a raid on his apartment in December 1969. He was 21 years old. An FBI informant named William O'Neill had provided the floor plan of Hampton's apartment to the agents who carried out the operation. O'Neill also allegedly slipped a sedative into Hampton's drink earlier that evening. Hampton was shot twice in the head at point-blank range while he lay unconscious in his bed. The county coroner ruled it a justifiable homicide. Martin Luther King Jr. was surveilled for years. The FBI sent him anonymous letters encouraging him to take his own life. Malcolm X was monitored extensively before his assassination in 1965. The tactics were consistent: identify leaders who could mobilize black Americans, then neutralize them by any means necessary. Tupac's family wasn't just aware of this history, they lived it. His mother, Afeni Shakur, was one of the most prominent members of the New York Black Panther chapter. In 1969, she was arrested along with 20 other Panthers and charged with conspiracy to bomb police stations, department stores, and other targets across New York City. The trial lasted 2 years, the longest criminal proceeding in New York history at the time. Afeni was 8 months pregnant with Tupac when she won her case. She represented herself and secured her own acquittal by dismantling the prosecution's witnesses on cross-examination. The FBI had files on her. They infiltrated her organization. They monitored her movements and her associations for years. Tupac's stepfather, Mutulu Shakur, spent over a decade on the FBI's most wanted list for his alleged involvement in a 1981 Brinks armored car robbery in Nyack, New York, that left 2 police officers and a security guard dead. He was captured in Los Angeles in 1986 and sentenced to 60 years in federal prison. He wasn't released until 2022, and he died shortly after from bone marrow cancer. His godmother, Assata Shakur, escaped from prison in 1979 after being convicted of killing a New Jersey state trooper during a 1973 traffic stop. She fled to Cuba, where she was granted political asylum by Fidel Castro. The FBI still lists her as a domestic terrorist with a $2 million bounty on her capture. His godfather, Geronimo Pratt, a decorated Vietnam veteran and Black Panther leader, was convicted of murder in 1972. And spent 27 years behind bars. His conviction was eventually vacated in 1997 after it came out that the prosecution's key witness was an FBI informant named Julius Butler, and that the Bureau had hidden wiretap evidence proving Pratt was at a Panther meeting in Oakland, 400 miles away, when the crime occurred in Santa Monica. This is the world Tupac grew up in. FBI agents weren't abstract villains from history books. They were the people who tried to destroy his family, who locked up his godfather on lies, who drove his stepfather underground for years. When Tupac rapped about the government, he wasn't theorizing, he was testifying. So when people suggest that the same apparatus that targeted the Black Panthers might have taken interest in their most famous descendant, they're not pulling the idea out of thin air. They're looking at patterns. By 1996, Tupac wasn't just a rapper. He was selling millions of records. All Eyes on Me moved over 5 million copies in its first 2 months. He was starring in movies like Gridlocked and Gang Related. He was speaking directly to young Black Americans about police brutality, poverty, and systemic racism in a way that actually resonated. His audience wasn't just listening to music. They were absorbing a worldview. And that worldview was explicitly revolutionary. Does that mean the government killed him? I can't tell you that. Nobody can prove it. The official investigation pointed toward Orlando Anderson, who was killed in an unrelated shooting in Compton 2 years after Tupac's death. In September 2023, Las Vegas police arrested Dwayne Keith Davis, also known as Keith D., who allegedly ordered the hit from the back seat of the white Cadillac that pulled up alongside Tupac's BMW that night. Keith D. had been talking about his involvement for years in interviews and in a memoir, apparently believing he couldn't be prosecuted. He was wrong. But the conspiracy theory persists because the case took 27 years to produce an arrest, because COINTELPRO was real, because Fred Hampton was real, because Geronimo Pratt spent 3 decades in prison for a crime the FBI knew he didn't commit, and because Tupac wrote a letter to the President of the United States, called out federal law enforcement by name, connected himself explicitly to the revolutionary tradition his family helped build, and was dead within a year of recording it. Maybe that's all coincidence. Maybe Orlando Anderson really did pull that trigger over a fight at a boxing match and a stolen death row chain. Maybe the simplest explanation is the right one. But Tupac knew the history better than anyone. He knew what happened to people who spoke too loud. He said it himself in his music over and over. He talked about dying young. He talked about his enemies. He talked about the target on his back. In interviews, he said he expected to be killed. He said he was living on borrowed time. The question isn't whether Tupac was paranoid. The question is whether he was right. Think about it. A 25-year-old rapper with the blood of revolutionaries in his veins, reaching millions of young people with messages about fighting back against a system designed to keep them down. A man who openly challenged federal authority, who named names, who connected his personal story to decades of government suppression of black leadership. A man whose family had been hunted, imprisoned, and exiled by the same agencies he was now calling out in front of the entire country. And then he's dead. Shot at a traffic light. Case unsolved for nearly 3 decades. What do you think really happened that night in Vegas? Was it gang politics, industry beef, or something bigger? Drop your theory in the comments. And if this story made you think, hit subscribe. We've got more coming that you won't want to miss.